Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be ranking every David Bowie studio album from worst to best. There are a lot of albums to get to here, so let's get started. Coming in at number 28, my least favorite Bowie record has to be his self-titled debut from 1967. Still very much Bowie looking for an identity, and I don't think his songwriting was quite there yet either, as he completely lacked the confidence and swagger at this point that he'd come into pretty quickly, and everyone, has to start somewhere, of course. Bowie just happened to start with, a more Baroque pop sound, and it's an interesting record to hear in hindsight, but not an album I listen to all that often, and it definitely has some strong moments, though, I'd say, tracks like Silly Boy Blue and Love You Till Tuesday, with some hints of, what's to come in the future here, but the rest of the record, I'd say, is pretty forgettable, and I know Bowie probably would have liked to have forgotten it as well, and I think it was a missed opportunity not to include the London Boys on this record, which was the B-side for Rubber Band, would have made the album a little bit stronger, but hey, at least a Laughing Gnome didn't make the cut. Number 27, Never Let Me Down, but unfortunately he did in 1987 with Never Let Me Down. This record is just one bad idea after another on this misguided album from what Bowie referred to as his Phil Collins years. The production is terrible, and, the record sounds incredibly dated and messy, in my opinion, and a lot of the ideas on here just feel really unfocused, and I'd like to nominate Shining Star for one of the all-time worst Bowie songs, featuring a mid-song rap by Mickey Rourke. Bowie was all about taking chances. That's one thing I love about his catalog, but this record just feels passionless and eccentric for the sake of being eccentric. Number 26, let's go with Pinups from 1973, released during Bowie's classic string of records here, and this certainly was an interesting way to follow up Aladdin Sane. It's a covers album featuring Bowie putting his own glam rock and proto-punk spin on, a lot of 60s tracks that influenced him, from bands such as the Yardbirds, The Who, Pretty Things, and more, and that's a really cool idea on paper, but in execution, a lot of these covers just feel rushed and sloppy, and I don't think Bowie does much on this record to really improve upon the originals. It's the only record from that 70s run that I would say is not essential top shelf Bowie, but I can still dig covers on here like See Emily Play, I Can't Explain, and Sorrow, but the rest of it I just never really took to. Number 25, Space Oddity from 1969, his sophomore record, and this is still Bowie throwing a lot of stuff at the wall here to see what sticks, but he made massive strides between his debut album and this record, in my opinion here, and the range is really interesting on this album, kind of the beginning of Bowie growing into a musical chameleon with elements on this record of psychedelic rock, folk, country, and prog, and while that's really interesting, I think it can also be a double-edged sword if you're not careful. This album feels a little erratic and without direction. Commercially, this is a one-song album, of course, with Space Oddity to start the record, but some other standouts for me include Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, one of the first songs produced by longtime Bowie collaborator Tony Visconti, and the really underrated album closer, in my opinion, Memory of a Free Festival. So some good stuff on here, but just in general, Bowie throwing, again, a lot to see what would stick. And Space Oddity, of course, did the title track, but not much else on here would be regarded as a Bowie classic. However, I do enjoy some scattered songs throughout. Next at number 24, let's go with Hours from 1999. I never really took to this record as much as his other 90s albums. Hours was a milestone release for Bowie, as he became the first major artist to release a new album on the internet. Bowie was always on the cutting edge of, what was new, including, the prominence of online music by the late 90s, and he followed up Earthling here by moving, on from the industrial tinge sound of, his two previous albums for a more art rock, poppy approach, and stylistically, some of these songs would not have sounded out of place on a record like Hunky Dory, but generally I find a lot of this album to be pretty unmemorable. However, some standouts on here do include Thursday's Child, Seven, and Survive, and with the exception of these songs, I feel like this record tends to lag just a little bit and can make for a pretty arduous listen at times. Number 23, Tin Machine 2 from 1991. I decided to include the two Tin Machine records on this list because I think that era is really important to Bowie's career, and I didn't just want to glance over it. The supergroup was comprised of Bowie, Reeves Gabrels, Tony Fox, and Hunt Sales, and it's a really cool project, but I think the band faced a difficult challenge here of having to, follow up their classic debut album. Tin Machine 2 is definitely not as strong as their first, and, the songs are more melodic, which is interesting, while still maintaining that hard rock sound of the first record. Bowie plays saxophone on this album, which is really cool, but I think the songwriting was significantly weaker on this record compared to the debut, that really brings this down for me. Pretty straightforward lyrical themes about love throughout the album, which is a departure from the more in-your-face and aggressive lyrics on the debut, and, Tin Machine, still super underrated, great project, but I think they peaked with their first record. However, Tin Machine 2 does have have some cool moments as well, like Baby Universal, Shopping for Girls, and Goodbye Mr. Ed. Number 22, 1984's Tonight. Good album. I think it's very overhated by a lot of people who consider it to be boring. I certainly wouldn't call it a boring record. Essentially, Bowie tried to make Let's Dance twice, with, Tonight including many of the same lineup from Let's Dance and the subsequent tour, as well as a similar creative process and sound, and Bowie was burned out here lyrically, and only wrote 2 songs himself. You also have 3 Iggy Pop covers and a Beach Boys cover here of God Only Knows. I'm a fan of Blue Jean. I really like Loving the Alien a lot. The collaboration with Tina Turner on the title track is cool. I think the album's biggest issue, and the reason why it's number 22 on the list and not higher, is because, there was a lack of new ideas here. This was a low point for Bowie creatively, especially coming off the success of Let's Dance just a year earlier. Number 21, let's go into the 90s here with 1993's Black Tie, White Noise. Recently married to Iman, Bowie tried to revamp his sound for the 90s with Black Tie, White Noise, recorded in the wake of the disbandment of Tin Machine, and Bowie draws a lot of inspiration here from house music, soul music, and funk, and I think the album is a lot of fun to listen to. Bowie sounds more confident here than he had in years, and this record isn't super cohesive, but I think it's best from a lyrical standpoint to split it up into 2. You have a mix of social and political commentary on here by Bowie, as well as lyrics inspired by his marriage, so kind of an interesting dichotomy there on this record, and I think it has some great variety. It was a definite step back in the right direction, for Bowie as a solo artist, with standouts like Jump They Say, the wedding song, You've Been Around, and the title track, so in general, good stuff. From here on out, we're in the good to great category here for these albums as we enter the top 20. Coming in at number 20, I'm going to go with 1993's The Buddha of Suburbia. And, not really a soundtrack. Only 1 song is actually from the show of the same name's 4-part run, even though the project was inspired by Bowie's work composing music for the BBC show. I really enjoyed this record, though, for what it is. Bowie was never afraid to experiment, and this record is his most creative outlet in years, as far as I'm concerned, using various different influences that harken back to some of his 70s stuff, including elements here of, rock, of course, but pop, jazz, ambient, funk, and more. And you have a few really interesting instrumental tracks on here. The title track, I think, is a really solid opener, and you have the ballad Strangers When We Meet as well. I don't think the material on here would have sounded too out of place somewhere in the middle of his Berlin trilogy on a record like Low or on side 2 of Heroes. At number 19, we have Heathen from 2002. I'm a big fan, personally, of the 21st century era Bowie stuff. Some of these records tend to be glossed over and not get talked about as much as they should, but I'm a fan of them, and musically, this album has a darker vibe, possibly influenced by the 9/11 attacks just a year earlier. I think the production on here creates a really bleak atmosphere, with Bowie working with Tony Visconti on a full-length album for the first time since 1980, so a great reunion here with Visconti, and Hours was not a super interesting record in my opinion, but I think the reunion with Tony made for a more interesting and creative sounding record, primarily a darker art pop with, modern sound to fit the 2002 times, and the record also features some really cool collaborations with Dave Grohl and Pete Townsend, and some standouts here for me include Sunday, Cactus is a great cover, Slip Away, Slow Burn, Afraid, I've Been Waiting for You, I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship, right, A Better Future, Heathen, The Rays is great, Everyone Says Hi. I really enjoyed this album, just top to bottom, a really fun and underrated album from 2002. Next up, let's go with the album's successor from 2003, Reality, coming in at number 18. Very underrated record here from Bowie. Again, those lesser talked about 21st century Bowie albums are full of gems, and this is a pretty eccentric record in atmosphere. There's a lot of angst on this album, but, it's really fun to listen to, with tracks like New Killer Star, Pablo Picasso, Looking for Water, and Never Get Old. You also have a great ballad on here with The Loneliest Guy, which I really enjoy. Interesting George Harrison cover of Try Some, Buy Some. I think The Loneliest Guy in particular is probably the best showcase for Bowie's vocals on this record, but he sounds great. His aged vocals sound fantastic on these songs, and this feels like a record that was written to be performed live, and his live stuff from the early 2000s is great, and the set list had a ton of variety to them. Bowie was just kind of playing whatever he wanted to around that time, and by the way, if you did not pick up the Record Store Day exclusive where he performed this album in its entirety, I definitely would recommend checking it out. Fast forward 10 years to Bowie's next album, The Next Day, released in 2013, my number 17 here on the list, and this is his first new album in 10 years, characterized by a more art rock approach and bleak lyricism. A very strong comeback record, in my opinion, as Bowie once again works with Tony Visconti, and this record, in my opinion, was his best since Earthling, and an album that he absolutely needed to make, to kind of reinstate that Bowie was back, and it was recorded in secrecy, and his return was a surprise. He'd previously retreated from the public eye after his heart surgery in the mid-2000s, but Bowie harkens back here to some of his 70s glam and funk work, but put the new spin on on it, in my opinion, full of fresh ideas, and even decades into his career and 10 years away, Bowie still found a way to reinvent himself with, great tracks on here like The Next Day, The Stars Are Out Tonight, Where Are We Now, Valentine's Day is probably my favorite song from this record, Boss of Me, Dancing Out in Space, How Does the Grass Grow, I'd Rather Be High, You Feel So Lonely, You Could Die. Awesome songs on here. Fantastic return for Bowie in 2013. At number 16, I'm going to go with Lodger from 1979, the final release of the Berlin trilogy, and, everyone has an opinion on Low, and everyone loves Heroes, but Lodger is the one record from that trilogy that seems to get lost in the shuffle. It doesn't get talked about as much as the other two from this era. Bowie worked with Brian Eno here and Tony Visconti, of course, and this record is different, I'd say, from the first two of the Berlin trilogy in that it lacks the electronic and ambient styles as well as the song and instrumental split. Instead, Bowie delves into more art rock, pop, and a little bit of new wave here as well, which I thought is pretty interesting and cool to hear. Working with King Crimson guitarist Adrian Belew, and for me, it's definitely not as strong as Heroes or Low, but I still like it a lot, and I think the record is very backloaded. I'm not a big fan of side 1, but side 2 is phenomenal here and much stronger than side 1 with tracks like late album tracks, great songs like DJ, Boys Keep Swinging, Repetition, and Red Money. Bowie once again reinvented himself in 1983 with Let's Dance, my number 15 here on the list, a post-disco, dance rock-oriented album, and his first on EMI Records. This was a new sound with a new label and a new producer, working with Nile Rodgers on Let's Dance, and I think Bowie found a great balance on Scary Monsters, but chose to capitalize here on the popularity of dance, rock, and pop with Let's Dance, and you could say it's a sellout of sorts, but, like everything else Bowie did, he made it into his own and seamlessly transitioned from genre to genre, and it was a huge commercial success for Bowie at the time. It's hard to listen to this album and not have fun hearing it, with tracks on here like the title track, Modern Love, Cat People, Without You, and his version, of course, of China Girl, which he wrote for Iggy Pop, and I still go back and forth between which version of that song I enjoy the best, but still, two great versions there. Love Bowie's version, of course. He wrote the song, so why not put it on this album after all? Despite being a product of its time, I still think it sounds fresh and vibrant 40 years later. Next, at 14, I'm going to go with The Man Who Sold the World, released in 1970. Bowie decided to make another change on his third record, moving away from the folk and acoustic sound of Space Oddity for a more hard rock charged approach. And lyrically, Bowie continued to grow on this album, expanding his range to themes of insanity, religion, technology, and more. And I really enjoy the guitar work on this record. The title track has an amazing riff to it, and Bowie's delivery creates such a cool and uneasy atmosphere. And Width of a Circle is probably one of the heaviest Bowie songs of all time. Certainly heavy and different for him at that time, and a great way to open the record. Well, it's a really cool way to kind of see the evolution of Bowie's sound, and I love to kind of follow that evolution throughout the first 4 or 5 records, and how he not only continued to improve, but grow as an artist as well, and this album is, I think, a big record for personal growth in his catalog, and I think it's a shame that this record is primarily full of deep cuts, and not talked about too often, because a lot of these tracks deserve to be talked about more, and it really wasn't until Nirvana covered the title track that it really had a resurgence, but to be honest, I prefer Bowie's version a lot more. Fantastic record with a lot of great deep cuts. How about Young Americans at number 13 here on the list from 1975? Time for Bowie's Plastic Soul era. Bowie was never one to let his sound go stale, and while he could have continued with the glam rock sound he found success with on Diamond Dogs, Aladdin Sane, and Ziggy Stardust, he decided to showcase more of an interest in rhythm and blues and soul on Young Americans, his next record, and I think the interest in R&B and soul, fit Bowie's voice really well, and the Philadelphia soul sound here Bowie fit perfectly with as he pursued it, and he took a really interesting approach here, more soulful as seen on tracks like the title track, great opener, Win, Fascination is great, Right, Somebody Up There Likes Me, his cover of the Beatles' Across the Universe, and then of course you have the classic collaboration with John Lennon on Fame, and looking back at Bowie's catalog as a whole, I'd argue this album is pretty ahead of its time. Number 12, let's go with the debut of Tin Machine, their first record here from 1989. Coming off the Glass Spiders tour, Bowie began collaborating with Reeves Gabrels on what would eventually become Tin Machine, and their debut record is absolutely crucial to the Bowie catalog in my opinion, because by the late 80s Bowie was feeling pretty lost creatively, and this project helped him to get back on track and to reinvent himself once again. Bowie, of course, a master of reinvention, so this album was crucial in finding himself in a new identity as we go into the 90s, which would stamp some of his most underrated records as far as I'm concerned. But Bowie writes some of his most interesting lyrics in years on this album. Lyrics are more intense and aggressive. The record has a bit more of an in-your-face type of vibe to it, and the supergroup experimented with various different sounds, and maybe it was even a little bit ahead of its time as they dabbled in a little bit of proto-grunge as well. Definitely an album that has aged extremely well in my opinion, and one that the band found very difficult to follow up on their second album a few years later. But to be fair, it's hard to top tracks on here like Heaven's in here, the title track, Prisoner of Love, Crack City, Under the God, great cover of Working Class Hero, really underrated stuff there. Video Crime, Sacrifice Yourself, and Baby Can Dance. So, really enjoyed Tin Machine. Didn't want to exclude them from this countdown. My number 11 on the list, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps from 1980, was Bowie's return to a more commercial sound, coming out of the Berlin trilogy and entering a new decade. And I think it found, like I said before, a great middle ground of finding a more accessible sound, but also not abandoning all the growth that he'd made over the past few years on Low, Heroes, and Lodger. I really like the new wave influence here, very artsy and post-punk as well. This record had a great lineup featuring the return of Robert Fripp and Chuck Hammer on guitars, as well as a guest appearance by Pete Townsend, produced by Tony Visconti, and in my opinion, this was Bowie's best solo record for 15 years, and, you know, how can you argue with that, with classics on here like Ashes to Ashes, It's No Game, Fashion, Teenage Wildlife, Because You're Young. I mean, so many great songs on here. The title track is phenomenal. Great guitar solo live. It's a stacked album and a perfect way to follow the trilogy of his most experimental work up to that point. Into the top 10 here with Hunky Dory from 1971, a brilliantly written record, and it takes the folk and hard rock elements of the earlier stuff and combines it with a piano-driven instrumentation, really well-written and expressive lyrics, and a wide range of themes and emotions conveyed in Bowie's vocal delivery. It's another really fun listen, and it's a lot of what I love about the early 70s Bowie albums all wrapped into one. And looking back on his whole catalog, I think it's very cool he was able to build on everything he'd done up to that point and really tie it all together in a way that was really easy on the ears here, with re-listenable moments on this album like Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, Life on Mars, Kooks, Quicksand, Andy Warhol, Song for Bob Dylan is fun. So really enjoyed this record, and like I said, it's kind of everything I love the most about those 70s Bowie albums all in one record. Really wanted to make sure I included this record in the top 10. Coming in at number 9, we have Outside, released in 1995. You know, as a huge fan of Earthling, I really enjoy the industrial era of Bowie. I think Outside revitalized his sound completely in the mid-90s with a different sound and approach. Working with Brian Eno on this record, the concept is really well thought out and interesting, and the songs are, you know, really interesting that they convey this unsettling atmosphere that's prominent throughout this entire record, kind of a recurring theme throughout. It's an excellent, you know, use of industrial with electronica, art rock, jazz, and ambient music, and to be honest, I think Bowie did more with the industrial sound than a lot of, you know, regular industrial bands did around this time period. I think Bowie took it as an artistic challenge, and it definitely paid off with songs on here like Outside, The Heart's Filthy Lesson, A Small Plot of Land, Hello Space Boy, The Motel, We Prick You, Voyeur of Utter Destruction as well. So there are really a lot of great songs on here. I love I'm Deranged, maybe my favorite song on this record, you know, so for me personally, again, I'm a huge fan of the industrial era, and I definitely wanted to show some appreciation for Outside, and I'll get into Earthling in a little bit. But, you know, I love this tour and this era of Bowie doing this stuff live as well, deciding to stray from playing the hits and focus more on the deep cuts and new material, even going as far as to, you know, rework some of the older stuff like Joe the Lion and The Man Who Sold the World to fit the industrial sound he was going with at the time. Number 8, Station to Station from 1976, the return of the Thin White Duke. Bowie was pretty bad off around this time period. He was thin and pale, deep into his cocaine addiction, and basically living only off of milk and peppers. And Bowie has said that he has next to no memory of recording this record, but even at his worst point, Bowie delivered with a classic album, and it's funky, it's avant-garde, pretty spacey at times as well. The 10-minute title track is an absolute masterpiece, and then you have some other standouts on here like Golden Years, Word on a Wing, TVC-15, Stay, and Wild is the Wind. At number 7, we have Diamond Dogs from 1974. The first album Bowie recorded after the disbandment of the Spiders from Mars, and the first to feature everyone's favorite recurring character in Bowie history, Tony Visconti, in 4 years. This was the final record of Bowie's glam rock period, and it doesn't get talked about as much as Ziggy, Stardust, or Aladdin Sane, but it's full of great songs on here, like Future Legend, Diamond Dogs, Sweet Thing, Candidate, Rebel Rebel's a classic, Rock and Roll With Me, We Are the Dead, 1984, Big Brother. Love this record here, and, you know, even though this is a primarily glam album, you can still hear elements of funk and soul throughout. Bowie was always thinking 2 steps ahead and was already planting seeds for his next reinvention on Young Americans. For number 6, I'm going to go with Earthling from 1997, and maybe some people would not have this ranked as high, but I love Earthling. You know, this was my introduction to David Bowie, as a matter of fact. I'm also a big Nine Inch Nails fan, and so I was hooked after hearing the collaboration with Trent Reznor Prisoner and I'm Afraid of Americans, and Bowie followed up Outside with another great industrial-infused record, once again adapting and changing with the times, and the sound and style fit Bowie perfectly. Love this look as well. Great time for Bowie here, and definitely I think more refined and condensed than Outside, with some really awesome tracks on here like Little Wonder, Looking for Satellites, Battle for Britain, 7 Years in Tibet has some of the heaviest lyrics Bowie ever wrote. Dead Man Walking is like a dance rock song right in the middle of this heavy record. Of course, I'm Afraid of Americans and Law, Earthling's on Fire. So some really heavy stuff musically and lyrically here, and a personal favorite of mine. I think it's Bowie's most aggressive and gritty work of the 90s for sure. Breaking into the top 5 here with Low from 1977. One of those records that took me some time to fully appreciate. Took several listens at first, and even now I still find new things on this record that I didn't notice before. Low is by far the most experimental album Bowie ever made. The first of the Berlin trilogy, right? Bowie detoxing with Iggy Pop and, keeping a low profile around this time as well. I think it really brought out the best in him creatively. Bowie worked for the first time with Brian Eno on Low, and they had instant chemistry together. I love his synth work on this record. I think it textures, the album really well. And then, of course, you have Tony Visconti's brutal splatting drum sound here, too. It's a very immersive and chaotic glimpse into Bowie's creative mindset around this time, diving into electronic and ambient styles, for the first time as well, which is cool. And I love the way Side 1 and 2 are broken up. Side 1 is composed of mainly shorter, more chaotic, avant pop songs, tracks like Speed of Life, Breaking Glass, What in the World, Sound and Vision, Always Crash in the Same Car, Be My Wife, A New Career in a New Town, and then, of course, Side 2 is made up mostly of instrumentals. I Love Warzawa and Subterraneans, and the whole record just conjures up this really uneasy vibe that has aged really well, and to be honest, it's energy that I'm not sure if Bowie is ever really able to recreate on any of his other records. For number 4, I'm going to go with Blackstar from 2016, the final Bowie record before his death, and Bowie was dying of cancer during the making of this album. He gave his fans one last great record, and he chose to keep his condition private, so when he died it was a shock, but after his passing it gave, the new record at the time a totally different meaning behind it lyrically, and in hindsight, Bowie drops a lot of hints about his attitude towards death on this album, and Bowie bowed out gracefully here with an amazing record and amazing creativity in the face of death, with masterpieces like Blackstar, Lazarus, one of my favorite Bowie songs ever, I Can't Give Everything Away, and Dollar Days. This is truly one of rock's greatest goodbyes, and I feel like I've said it before on the channel, but it really feels like the final evolution of Bowie's sound, incorporating elements of just about every Bowie reinvention up to that point, including pop, art rock, jazz, experimental, EDM, and more, and had to put it in the top 5, but, I could rank this even higher. Ask me tomorrow, and this could definitely be in the top 3. At this point, it's all really close together for me, so coming in at number 3 for today, at least, as we get into the top 3 here, I'm going to go with Heroes from 1977. Definitely the most accessible, I'd say, of the Berlin trilogy, and like Low, you have the split songs with lyrics and more instrumental-driven songs on side 1 and 2, respectively. I absolutely love the guitar work on this record by Robert Fripp of King Crimson, one of the greatest of all time, and his collaboration with Bowie is really cool. There's definitely a lot of spontaneity on this record, as a lot of these tracks were composed on the spot in the studio, and I think Heroes does a great job of building upon the more electronic and ambient, driven sound of Low. I think it's slightly more refined than Low, and I think Robert Fripp definitely helped that. Standouts here for me include Beauty and the Beast, Joe the Lion, of course the classic title track Heroes, Sons of the Silent Age, Moss Garden, The Secret Life of Arabia is great, Blackout, from top to bottom, great record, lots of classics on here, and I think a great mix of deeper tracks as well. It's a more consistent listen as well compared to, the two other of the Berlin trilogy, but really well structured from top to bottom, definitely belongs in the top 3. Number 2, Aladdin Sane from 1973, initially described as Ziggy Stardust Goes to America, as Bowie was influenced a lot by his experience on tour in the US. This record is slightly more explosive and energetic than the Ziggy record, but it's full of upbeat rockers too. Rockers on here like Watch That Man, Aladdin Sane, Drive-In Saturday, Panic in Detroit, Cracked Actor, the Gene Genie's a lot of fun as well. But then you have some great, more ballad-heavy tracks on here, like The Prettiest Star, Time is great, Lady Grinning Soul, awesome, ominous album closure there, and there's a great variety on here in the midst of this, great glam rock period in Bowie's catalog on an incredible run of records. Aladdin Sane and Ziggy Stardust alternate between my two favorite Bowie albums of all time, and the two albums kind of go hand in hand. For me, they're both 10 out of 10 records, but there can only be one that's the best. And that best record can only be The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, released in 1972. Bowie has such a vast and wide-ranging catalog, but this record, I'd say, still remains his magnum opus in my opinion, and conceptually, it's pretty loosely tied together, but it's one of the best rock operas of all time. Bowie taking on probably his most iconic character here of Ziggy Stardust, and there's a feeling of excitement and spontaneity on this record that's just infectious. I think Bowie was able to reach new heights here creatively. I think the Ziggy Stardust character allowed for him to become more confident in his songwriting and a bit more eccentric as well. There are no skips on this record, and standouts, really the whole thing, but standout tracks for me include 5 Years, So Love, which I always thought was very John Lennon, Moon Age Daydream, Starman, of course, the big hit. His performance of Starman on Top of the Pops is really what put Bowie on the map, made him a superstar. Lady Stardust is great. Hang On to Yourself, Ziggy Stardust, Suffered at City, one of my favorite Bowie songs ever, and Rock and Roll Suicide. Just, again, no skips here. It's a 10 out of 10 record, and in my opinion, the only way that this album could have been made even better is if The Shadow Man would have made the cut. Great song from the Ziggy Stardust sessions, but it took Bowie decades to finally perfect it. So that wraps up this video here, ranking 28 David Bowie studio albums from worst to best. This was a long one here. Lots of albums to talk about, but this was a challenge, but I was up to it. Definitely wanted to rank the entire catalog here instead of just doing a top 10. So hopefully you guys enjoyed my ranking here, and if you enjoyed it or agree with it, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel down below. We just hit 4,000 subs on YouTube. Thank you all so very much for your support and believing in the channel. It means a lot. Truthfully, it really does. So thank you all. And if you have not subbed to the channel, please go ahead and feel free to do so and join the community here. And let me know down in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on my list, and what are some of your favorite and least favorite Bowie albums of all time? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.